Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1134th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs at the Rail, and I have the extreme privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Sharon Johnston and Nile Greenberg. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Sharon Johnston is a founding partner of Johnston Marklee, based in Los Angeles, California, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Since its establishment in 1998, Johnston Marklee has been recognized nationally and internationally with over 50 major awards for their engagement with arts and culture, including the American Academy of Arts Letters Award in Architecture in 2022. The book on the firm's work, House is a House is a House is a House is a House, was published by Birkhauser. Sharon has taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and served as artistic director of the 2017 Chicago Architecture Biennial together with partner Mark Lee. And our host today, Nile Greenberg, is a founding partner of ANY, a New York City-based office that synthesizes structure, materials, culture, organizations, and media as architecture projects. Greenberg is the editor of the Brooklyn Rail's architecture section, is the co-author of the Advanced School of Collective Feeling, and has taught as an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia University GSAPP. He curated the exhibition Two Sides of the Border, inaugurated at the Yale School of Architecture Gallery, and edited the synonymous book for Lars Muller. Greenberg has worked at Moss Architects, Soil, Young Long, and New York and Los Angeles, focusing on cultural and public architecture, such as the Los Angeles LGBT Center and the Kitchen. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Niall to get us started.
Hi, really great to encounter this conversation and to do this with Sharon on the subject of the exhibition Europa America by the photographer Candida Höfer. Sharon's office curated and designed the exhibition at Sean Kelly in Los Angeles. The show is a selection of works from Candida, who has an astonishing amount of work over the entire world and has done so much incredible photography. Candida was born in 1944 and went to the Kunstakademie Dusseldorf, which to photographer and art lovers is a very amazing and important school, and is part of the in terms of photography is kind of she's kind of a core not really official member, but person involved in what is shorthand is like the Dusseldorf School of Photography, which is really something starting with Bernd and Hilda Becker. Bernd Becker was her teacher there in the 70s. And she went on to do like incredible work capturing interiors and architecture, and has been a huge piece of inspiration for many architects and artists and bibliophiles and like anyone who's like interested in knowledge and creativity. Her work is really about documenting the spaces and the kind of monuments to culture that our world has built. This is libraries, theaters, museums, archives, and even more intimate spaces, such as private home, like libraries, like these space, but all of them capture the spirit of kind of building space for knowledge. And her work is a testament to what we've done in that realm. A lot of it is such a kind of generous way to capture work in the style of the Dusseldorf School, which is this extremely almost high resolution, perfect image that's so vast and empty that it almost becomes like form itself. It's a very beautiful type of work, and it's very exciting to see it here. And Candida's work is just very generous. It captures and brings us to all these places around the world. Um, and with that, I would like to introduce Sharon Johnston, and I thought maybe she can start by walking us through the designing the exhibition, the kind of how this project came to life, where what Candida kind of means in your work, but kind of give us an overview of your exhibition. Thank you.
Great, Nile. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Maybe I'll start with just talking about sort of the conception of the exhibition and even going, starting before our involvement, which was last year. The Sean Kelly Gallery in New York asked Toshiko Mori, who's a colleague of ours at the GSD at Harvard, and has done the spaces for Sean Kelly to curate a show of Candida's work in New York. And that was entitled Heaven and Earth, and very beautiful show that, in some level was capturing the sort of heavenly celestial qualities of many of the spaces Candida looks at with works that are more grounded and perhaps sort of earthbound. And so we when we were asked by the gallery to consider a show in the Los Angeles gallery of Sean Kelly, we were wanted to think in relationship to that. I mean, part of what we love about Candida's work is that it helps us bring spaces and geographies together that maybe we wouldn't have thought to be related before, and that's such a profound part of her work. So we've thought about her work geographically, and the idea that she, of course, has such a, maybe many people know her work from these amazing historic places that she's documented in Europe, but she has a really interesting and maybe somewhat surprising body of images from America. And so we love this idea of Toshiko's work was somehow about a vertical connection that we would think horizontally about the connection of Europe and America. And so that became the thesis for our work. It was somewhat inspired by writings and some books that Eric Mendelsohn had completed in the late 20s. He made a kind of beautiful photographic essay book connecting Russia, Europe, and America. And so we were sort of inspired by this sort of almost catalog-like format to that book as a way to find relationships between these emerging countries in that early 20th century. And so the exhibition is in one room, really, in the gallery, the ground floor gallery at Sean Kelly in Los Angeles. And its baseline condition looks very much like this view. There's one central freestanding wall. And that became sort of a clear organizing architectural element for us, which divides the entire show in two. So when you enter the gallery, which is this view, the West, America is in the first gallery, and the European images are in the second gallery. And I think there's a subtle one more point to make, which is that you can see in the left part of this image, there's a very subtle difference in the wall color, which is both demarcating this break, and feels almost like a kind of shadow. You're not quite sure if it's a color or a shadow from that central wall that marks the boundary between the two rooms.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought we could start with a few questions about kind of first the organization of the show. I think I'm very interested in the kind of division you've made between the kind of two categories, US and Europe. And I was wondering, kind of in our world, which is a very complex and twisted and tangled geopolitical new order that's kind of emerging slowly, like how do you imagine like her work and this kind of division in the exhibition kind of can help kind of untangle or unite, or what is your thoughts on the kind of it's like what are your thoughts on geopolitical situation in
landscape?
the world? But no, but how do you imagine like art and this piece, her work in particular as kind of being a part of that conversation? as
Yeah.
Mendelssohn as well also.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously in some ways it feels the title of the show is sort of taken on even more strong taken on more strong contrast in recent weeks. But I think what, is so important to us, Candida always, her work is in the background of our thinking. Her work is all over our library. And I think because, of course, this building from her time in Dusseldorf, but she's taken it, in her own personal way. I think this strategy, almost documentary method, something that is at some level almost bearing witness at first glance, but has so much more personal and profound attention. And once you spend time with the work, and I think what, in our own thinking and practice, for us, finding ways to find relationships between things, whether, like at the Chicago Biennial, I mean, all of the work there was really about building a platform for shared ideas. And I think somehow using this, I mean, we try not to see it as a kind of binary, but like what does looking at her work through this lens, what does it show, how does it help us see relationships or commonalities between things and difference? It's not only about creating differentiating, but finding things that link both, across continents and across spaces. And so I think that was a really profound underlying, connection to this kind of Mendelssohn thesis that we wanted to spend time with thinking about in preparing the exhibition. And I, of course, like just, the work spans in terms of when the images were made about 20 years, from 2000 to, I guess, 2022, I think is the most recent image. But, in historic time, I mean, there's such a big gap between the work in Europe and the work in the Americas that's on view. But I think at the same time, because Candida's techniques of looking and making images, I mean, the consistency of it helps us find, put difference and similarities, helps us see that in different ways. And I think that's what's so exciting about spending a lot of time with her work.
Yeah, did you guys, how did you, what was the curatorial process for you guys? Were
Yeah, I think
you doing like lots of images or?
we once we sort of accepted with Candida that this would be a reasonable framework to curate the show, that it set up a very kind of clear body of work that we could choose from. And then I think there was the idea of, physical qualities of the images, the perspective views, the frontals 1 point perspective, the kind of frontality, let's say, of the library images that are in the show. We wanted to create a sort of collection of slightly differentiated types of images that Candida is known for. And then there's like a few wild cards in the show. I think the MoMA image is a little bit exceptional. When we were talking with Candida and Herbert, her husband and collaborator, they talked about sort of remembering both for the MoCA image and the MoMA image that they didn't really remember exactly if those were experiences where they, cleared the museum and sort of went through the formal process that they normally do, or just sort of took the picture. And I think the sort of immediacy of those two images is somehow evident. And, I think a bit of a rule break for her, but I think also reveals just her sensitivity to feeling space when she's there and going for it. And maybe in contrast to these more constructed images like this one at Napoli.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really good background because the MoMA one did stand out to me as a kind of, I mean, even the perspective and
Yeah.
the incredible genericness of that scene is just so I think is important because if it wasn't MoMA, like you might not think so hard about it, right?
Right.
I think that kind of it's a very it's a space very much in the United States, let's say, or say in some like context of that kind of global museum setup. But one thing I wanted to like discuss that really I hadn't thought that hard about in her work and is well placed in the show is the difference between the content,
Mhm.
like how important is the content in her work in a way? Like these the documentation is so consistent in a way, so vivid and objective's like the wrong word, but maybe that's what they like would would be a good word for it, but one I'm less interested in using.
Mhm.
But it has this kind of overall or all-encompassing sense of a room, no matter how big or how small it is. It kind of takes in as much as the eye
Mhm.
can see, or in this case, the lens.
Mhm.
Um, and also when I had seen the Toshiko show in New York, I honestly hadn't been hit with the intensity of the scale of these things and the prints, which
Mhm.
are just so incredibly large and kind of dematerializes like the point of view. Even though you're in one point perspective, it
Mhm.
really makes it quite strange to stand in front of these things, and it turns these rooms into objects
Mhm.
themselves. So I'm wondering like how you thought of the content in these. There's a kind of setup that you framed, but with very few images. But what do you think, like, what types of spaces do you think she's trying to capture and why? And what does that
Yeah,
mean
I
for
think, you said it at the beginning, I mean, especially the European works, that it's illuminating places of important cultural history, and spaces of knowledge, spaces that seem maybe expected as sort of high culture spaces. But I think what is so just profound about spending time. I mean, it's sort of almost a shame to look at these images, over the Zoom screen, because I mean, they're beautiful photographs or reproductions, but just as you said, the physicality of them is so intense when you're right there in front of them. And I think one of the things that I feel this experience working with these images and spending time in the show brought forward for me in particular was, like, as you say, that the frame is so wide and there's so much information that these monumental spaces you would assume would sort of be off-putting, but because there's so much detail in these images, you're first drawn in because of the one-point perspective, but then your eye is moving around to these very intimate moments because of the resolution of the image. And I find that sort of dynamism, the equilibrium of both the hierarchy of the perspective, yet the intimacy of the details in the image, incredibly rich, to engage with. And I guess a last thing that is most evident, I think, in the European works, but operates a little differently in the images we picked for the American work, is the sense of interiority of these images. I mean, most of the European images, are empty of people. And that whole process of finding the space to do that. I mean, they're obviously daytime images, because of the way that light is entering into the space, and how the light, the way that she exposes the image, it's almost like the windows are almost um, overexposed. So there's this kind of weird otherness of the interiority, the sense of time, and how the light sort of starts to erase some of the monumentality of the image. And I think that's, just literally talking about light in the images is, I think, a really interesting aspect of, a narrative layer of how she's depicting these places and creating a new kind of story about her feeling of their qualities.
Yeah, it is notable, especially in the European set here, of the one point perspectives kind of intensity.
Mhm.
Um, I was wondering like um how do you this interiority you're discussing, how do you view this as an architect, as there's obviously a big difference or no difference or some sort of debate around interior versus exterior of a building. I think in photography it's quite interesting because it's one point perspective is really generated from like a void of some kind in a way. So needs to be in the middle of the street or something. And this differs a lot from, the history of the Dusseldorf School, which is Burned and Hill Becker's photography. So I wonder how you see her work in that kind of lineage and how that interiority is different and meaningful, and what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing, I mean, that's, of course, for us, the sort of relationship of the interior. The problem of the interior is fascinating. It's been a subject of a couple of our studios at Harvard, but, we've always sort of, thought about this sort of Losian idea of the sort of gentlemanly, gentlewoman exterior, the idea of a building that is very much being responsive to its neighbors, that's maybe more somehow part of a fabric of a city, let's say. And the interior is a place of more expressiveness, of a place of more more difference. And so we find it interesting that, like, you begin, because of the richness of these images and the way that light from the outside is subtly there. And interestingly, in a lot of her images, in these European images, it's side light, which is, typically a more domestic kind of light, versus institutions and museums where often light comes from skylights and monumental, roofs. So I think that this way that she is reminding us of the life of the city outside, or some otherworldliness, is I think fascinating, that to kind of, it contributes to the sort of vibration-like quality of these images, that you're somehow they seem stable. They're one-point perspectives. You don't get any more, hierarchical than that. But the way she uses light, I mean, here, this is in Carpi, there's no exterior light, but what's interesting in that, above the first layer of the box seats, there's a sort of very bright, weird lights that are, like these white orbs that make it feel really artificial and almost jarring. So I find that tension between what seems normative and expected with the details, the ceiling fresco, but this weird sense of artificiality in the way those lights are present is part of that kind of otherness that we discover more and more as we spent time with the work.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, I do think this. One thing I encountered in kind of doing research on this is the fact that so little is staged, and that, like, I kind of just assumed, like, these are like these immaculate images, the theater's rented for a day, but instead I found something else, which is a much more kind of faster kind of process, and a kind of more like walk in, capture it, and leave, which is really, it really makes it even that much more impressive. But that otherness you're talking about of the lighting or the interiority is pretty amazing.
Yeah, just imperfection, like at first glance it seems so perfect, but I mean, obviously there's a quality of time here that you need to spend time with these images, and that sort of those imperfections and other things reveal themselves.
Yeah. And what do you think of the emptiness of everything? Like, do you think these places are empty? Or like, I do believe that people are not photoshopped out. But I think that's, like, maybe comparing, to her work to maybe someone like Thomas Struth, where, if you think of those images of museums where there's people looking, I mean, that somehow you're as much looking at the work at the space, at the work on the wall, and the people, and you're imagining those narratives. So without people, it does make you think of, makes us think about sort of what happened just before, what will happen later. There's a whole other sort of imagination that I think you're drawn into in these images that makes them very human, that you really can put yourself in there. You're not looking out, but you're in there, and you're in the space in a way. And I think that's also maybe a bit different than her colleagues from the Dusseldorf School, where there's a sort of even more flatness in a lot of that work that makes it
something to look at versus what I see in her work and feel is that you can enter in. You want to find out, where is that light coming from, or is that an opening, or is it paint? There's all those sort of that richness.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. It's like there's much more three-dimensionality to
Mhm.
these than there are to Gursky or Burned and Hildebecker. Those often those are about flatness.
Yeah.
And
If you could, Chloe, if you could bring up the Uffizi image, I think it's a really interesting one to talk about. I think, yeah, it's the red walls. This one, yeah. And then there's a detail. Um, but like the ceiling, as I understand, the kind of vault of this room is, I think it's painted, but somehow the way the exposure is, it almost feels like it's perforated, and the floor is like almost richer than any surface in the entire room. And so it's really like very, this vibration is something I feel in looking at her work, where things are oscillating and moving, and things that seem flat or frontal. And, I think that's really incredibly interesting to see the
yeah,
objects and the
that
pedestal and all of
yeah,
that.
and I really recommend going and finding these in person because that
Yeah.
is sense. It's like it's really a it's funny, it makes you just realize space is still, or like,
Yeah.
there is that problem of, okay, if I go into a room, it's actually not moving, but that's what liveness is about. Like it is moving, it is
Yeah.
vibrating, and these do such a good job of somehow putting you in that state of mind.
Hmm.
And yeah, I wonder, you were talking about kind of how it makes you think and feel. And I find something as a designer myself, and you're a designer, like something different about her work, which is not like it's not as generative. It's not like you're not like looking at it almost as a reference.
Uh-huh.
You're like, oh, I should do, a project like
Yeah.
it's really bringing something else into the mind of like its heroics of these spaces, and it's almost like monument to what architects do and not a way to practice architecture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was
I wonder how
thinking,
you
yeah,
yeah.
I was thinking about that when we were talking the other day, and sort of how we've looked at Candida's work over the years of our practice. And it's true, it's not, I think there's something about the kind of humanity of these rooms, the way she brings a humanity to these, often monumental spaces that, I think it's the sort of lack of hierarchy between the texture of the book and the shelf, the marble of the floor. Like somehow things come into relationship with each other in a way that is very human, I think. And you can imagine, I think again, the format of the images makes an entry point for one to enter in and imagine being in the space. And I feel that's the quality, that it's a quality of space. It's not a precedent like, oh, I want to make a library like this, but I want to make a room that has a feeling like this. There's a generosity about, I think, what she conveys about these spaces. Like the Morgan Library images, for example, are I mean, maybe a lot of folks are in New York and know that space, but just the way the light on the shelves sort of creates reflects off the metal that encases the books. It somehow feels just so soft and so accessible. And I think that's something quite ineffable, but something that we all know and feel when we're around it.
Yeah, I like that. Like it does make you feel like, oh, you can just walk, like these
Yeah.
places exist and you
Yeah.
should go there and see a show or pull a book from the library. But I also like what you said earlier about how your work, or how basically this offers this approach of like the rich of a richness of interior,
Mm.
and that like somehow the interiors can be the design of something, which is
Mm.
not like the most, a lot of people think architects like buildings to look a certain way.
Mhm.
Like that's what we do, like make crazy buildings.
Right.
But there's lots of great historic work that's actually quite about this interior idea. I mean, the Morgan Library is a great example of something with, despite Charles McKim literally having a mental breakdown working on the Morgan Library and having to be like paused by the
Mhm.
firm. So he
Mhm.
was working very hard on the facade, but you know, the interior organization and these finishes is so important to great works of architecture. It's
Mhm.
very nice to connect that to your work, you know, very much about that all often offers like these rich interiors.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. That's not really a question, but just
Yeah,
like
no, but I appreciate that, and
you know,
I
leading.
think,
Yeah.
for architects, I mean, as for young architects, as as teachers working with young architects, we feel that, you know, I mean, personally, as as professionals, we feel, I mean, we're certainly not interior designers. We love furniture, and we think about, the planning, the setting of a room, like the planning of a city. I mean, how things are placed in a room is, so important to how the space feels. And I think, I mean, I was just thinking about the placement of furniture and the amount or lack of furniture in a lot of Candida's images. I mean, here there are some, and they do something incredible in the way they create another surface of reflection. But I do think that's a really important. I mean, part of it is also, often it feels more intimate, it feels more human scale, the problem of the interior. So it is, I think it's important to see it in relationship to architecture, but not as a seamless thing, that somehow it's one more layer in the making of space, as an architect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that does feel
I
very
mean,
relevant.
one image
I
that's
like
sort
the
of interesting, yeah,
city
that just
planning.
looking at the Mocha image, and I think Herbert told me this weekend when we were looking at the show that, so it's a library image, Chloe, with the vault. No, sorry, it's Mocha. So where is
I like
that?
it.
Isn't that it? It should be in
Mm,
there.
I saw it somewhere.
Maybe it's not in this deck. Oh, there, it's right on the, it's you just had it. Yes, there, the one image on the left. So apparently, Candida was at MoCA, and it wasn't that she necessarily had planned to photograph this. This is the library of the Isesaki building. So it's the barrel vaulted space. And I mean, if you zoom in on it, it's incredibly, the room is really kind of messy. There's a lovely model of the building sitting on top of one of the shelves. So this was sort of of course, we wanted this image in the show because of it being in LA, but it's, another kind of, way in which, the interior, like maybe it's an exception in her work, but there's something so lovely about its messiness, in this collection of other images, like the Masonic Temple in Philadelphia, which is next to it, which is anything but messy and out of
Yeah,
order.
I feel like I would really like to see this Mocha one in
Yeah,
real.
it's a
Like
great
it has
image.
this perfect, like it's a linear room just off of the access, like
Yeah.
very nice. So I thought like I had this question about photography, like
Mm.
almost like how you use photography in your work. I don't think everyone quite realizes like how the digitally produced image, like renderings, have become like so like almost the easiest way to design something now. And that's a relatively new phenomenon. Just the speed of production of like working through renderings, which really are based on photographic principles, right? They
Mhm.
are,
Mhm.
um, lots of people work within that medium, but I wonder, like, what is what has been your relationship with photography in your work, and how have you designed with it in the past?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
um, in general, yeah, like what, like and how does Candida work in this? Who is kind of documenting things, but now, you can almost design this way, which you never really could, right? It's plan and section and perspective and um, these other more tools of drawing and collage. But I wonder, like, how do you think like photography is changing
Mhm.
um, the world for architects right now?
Well, that's a big question. But I mean, I will answer in a couple different ways. I mean, on the one hand, just going back quickly for, to speak about PAV and sort of why we wanted to do that. Why did we want to bring together physical objects, Photographs. There's a whole selection of photographic, a curated project of photography. But at some level, it was sort of a resistance to the kind of smoothness and ubiquity of all different kinds of image making and our access to them. And somehow the idea of bringing together real objects and looking at things in relationship to other things in tangible ways seems, at one level almost anachronistic today, but also really, really interesting and a very generative environment to talk with colleagues and to understand the world. And so I think
We
that
may need to introduce it. Sorry, I didn't mean it to go directly into the collages, but we might have to introduce a little bit
okay.
this project.
Okay, yeah. So you want to do that now?
I was just thinking like how I was trying to we can do that. Yeah. I mean, I was interested in kind of how you were thinking about photography as a whole,
Yeah.
as part of the process. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, we work with photographs in really different ways. Of course, we commission photographers, architectural photographers to document our work. But we also, I think it's related to our interest in history and sort of and all of that, which was we began by looking at the techniques of collage, looking at canonical images of architectural history as a way to test ideas that we were generating in our own work. And so in around 2002, I think we made our first collage, which was this image of the Hill House that borrowed from House by Julia Schulman. So I think the practice of the collages was about creating a dialogue with these images of history that were really familiar to many people that captured, especially in Los Angeles for us, qualities of living that we wanted to interrogate and think about in our work as young architects, decades after these images were made. And so I think that's one body of work with image making. These works have evolved. We've borrowed from film, we've engaged with painting, but I think this idea, I think this is an ongoing interest of ours related to image making, which is connecting our work to history, and the collage is part of that discourse. I think we've also, so these are, this is the Kaufman House in Palm Springs. And, here we were integrating these images of Schulman into a house that we were designing called the Sail House, where qualities of flatness and depth, interior and exterior, as we've talked about, foreground and deep space were part of what we were thinking about. And so, these images are made at different times in the evolution of projects. Sometimes early when we're trying to distill something, like the Hill House image and this image, and other times they're maybe more like post-produced. So it just depends, and it's evolved. And then there's been other projects like the images that our artist collaborators created for us for House as a House, which were more like portraits. And I just wanted to, I read something recently that Candida had, it's a quote of hers, and she said, I see my work to some extent as portraits of spaces. This is also why I consider myself not to be an architecture photographer. They would focus on other things. I thought that was quite beautiful in relationship to the kinds of ways we think about photography, which is maybe more diverse than one single answer.
Yeah, I think that is really nice. There's something very hard for me to think of her as an architecture photographer.
Yeah.
Very strange, right? Because as an architect, it's so pleasant to be in front of her work. And I'm surrounded by, books of hers, which I look at constantly. And I wonder, yeah, like so, a lot of these images we're seeing from your office's like collage projects, which are really amazing, also worth seeing in person when they're quite large and material. But I wonder like what other and you mentioned a few that you've worked with other artist photographers, but I also sort of know that you have quite a library, let's say, maybe that books are and print, which is a big part of her work, is um, also part of your kind of like archival practice. Even the reference to this obscure book by Mendelssohn, which I've never heard of, and
Yeah.
I'm like already shopping for it. You know, like I gotta get this book.
It's expensive.
Yeah. But I wonder what the role of in a way you've built your own little Candida Höfer library, right? I mean, that is kind of part of your you've sort of created your own kind of space for that kind of contemplation, quiet,
Mhm.
um, review of this huge archive. Like, what do you think about like an artist such as yourself kind of being surrounded by this kind of material? Like, what is the importance of
Mhm.
work like this to be at hand and in print, I hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've seen our office, I think it is, it's a place of collections. I think we both, material of our own output and these collaborative projects, these images are on the walls in our office. I think it's related to our mode of practice, which is, starts each project starts in very different places, but references, creating a sort of ecology of ideas. Oftentimes that includes artist work, images, material. There's a sort of almost archival way that the kind of landscape of a project is built up. And I think for us and for our collaborators, sorry, our collaborators, that becomes the material of what we draw from when we're designing a project. So I think having it present in your peripheral view is really inspirational, I guess. I mean, at some level, we just love to be surrounded by these things.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an achievement, like a library, you know. And I like a lot of her work that has like weird private libraries, like small one that aren't necessarily some incredible collection, but maybe just a creative person,
Yeah.
you know, or someone who just, you know, has a collection of books in some way or the other. Um, I mean, I think it's I don't know. I still don't really know why it's so important to kind of be cloaked in books, but I do think it's critical to the kind of process of making something.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe it's just sublimating one's kind of vision for all these others as well, you know, or but yeah, I think it's like so nice. I would love, you know, some Candida photos of the Johnston Marklee office.
What a great idea, Niall.
Would be very nice. But I love that part of her work. And here we're seeing some we didn't maybe we can introduce these are
Yeah.
photos you guys commissioned of many interiors of your projects by
Yeah,
different artists.
they're all images somehow of different projects. This is Livia Corona. This is, from the early 2000s. So when she was doing a little bit more documentaries type of work. And this was the client for this house was called Sale. Their last name was Sale, and the house was not occupied yet. And so she made this portfolio of images called House for Sale. So she was playing off this idea of the empty house and the kind of looky-loos. And at the same time, she had an interest in kind of gerontology and kind of thinking about culture, the culture of older people. And so she hired these actors and they sort of take over the house in different ways. And I think that, this idea of the emptiness of the house was so beautiful to us that she then, and then the furniture was curated, of course, in relationship to the rooms. And this house is on the site of an early Morphosis building called the 2468 Studio. And so there was also a sort of thing about the host and the guest and all of that related to kind of different moments in time of these buildings. So we love those, the idea of when we work with artists that have created these portraits that were in House as a House, we gave them there's no like parameters at all. It really was like a portrait. I mean, that the artists sort of looked completely without any parameters from us. And I think that's kind of fascinating that we see the work differently through their eyes because we open it up to them. I think there's something about that exchange and circularity that we find really generative and creative.
Yeah, these are all like really amazing portraits from different artists. Yeah, portraits is again maybe the right word, right?
Yeah.
And it's not really capturing the architecture, but
Yeah, I mean,
something that is done within it or after it or through it.
mhm.
So yeah, that's a really nice form of representation. And also it's analytical. Like I don't think photography, and I like maybe about Candida's work is it's not like designed for um wide circulation necessarily. It's not like some media product.
Mhm.
It's very intentionally a form in itself as
Mhm.
an object and not something that's necessarily scalable, digitizable. So yeah, I think I'm curious about your what if that's I just kind of want to know, it's like very hard to know like how you think of Candida's. I know I feel like I've asked this already, but I'm just still trying to figure out like how do we use her work
Mhm.
to accelerate our own work and like and the achievements we can keep going forward with. Um,
Well, I mean, at one level, besides maybe some of the qualities that we describe in her work, I think she teaches us, to look intensely. And I think that, that going back to the sort of internet problem, there's something about feeling the sensitivity of her eyes. Like, I mean, I don't know if we could quickly go back to the Beinecke image, but, I mean, that's a space so many architects know. But I feel she, reveals it in both, a way it's enough there that we know it's the Beinecke. But let me see, where is that? Do you know which one that is, Chloe? It's the kind of, it's maybe
yeah, so
this one, this up a little bit with the rows of books. Yeah, that one.
yeah,
That we sort of have the facade. We know that the kind of marble facade, but there's something about the way the light works in this image and the flatness of the light behind the books it always seems like this glowing, otherly kind of place when you're there. But I feel the way Candida's image represents this space, it feels like, I don't know, it just makes the room feel more accessible than it does when you're there. And I think that's a really profound thing, that you somehow, maybe it's this humanity again, that she it's both monumental and intimate. And I think that's something that is so, important to make spaces that have that dynamism that's almost imperceptible. But if you spend time there, you can grasp it. And I think, those are qualities that we feel the best spaces in history have this, monumental and everyday, empty and full, flatness and depth, like all these sort of things that can't really be resolved, or what are the best things I think about architecture.
beautiful. That's a great place to are we moving on yet, Chloe? I mean, I do think that's an artist's job is to find these paradoxes
Yeah,
and to do
yeah,
it
exactly.
visually, like that's almost impossible in such a rare approach.
Mhm.
So that's
Perhaps in a way, I mean, that's what's so hard about, this pervasive rendering culture to
yeah,
find that sort of lack of, I mean, to disrupt that, the smoothness of those kinds of images. I mean, it's done, but it's hard to do. And I think that the stillness of her images, I think is, I mean, not to be nostalgic, but to say that there's resistance in the image. And I think
yeah,
that's a quality that I think has,
yeah,
has lasting.
completely. Yeah, and I think that's I mean, this culture has also made me so skeptical of photography
Mm.
in many forms, right? And I think so many people are moving away from it, out of that kind of skepticism of the kind of photoshopped
Mhm.
object, the impossible lighting. that we can now do with such technical means.
Mhm.
And interestingly, you know, Candida, it has a quite powerful digital, it's not all film or something. Much of it is done on digital cameras. And so it's really not the tool in this case, it's the eye and the space and like all this other stuff that's been done. So I really look at it for like this humanity you're describing, right? And this
Yeah.
paradox that she can find.
Thank you both so much for this conversation, which has been a pleasure to listen to. I encourage audience members who have a question for our Q&A to post it in the form in the chat, but I'm going to open up our Q&A with a few questions that I have. In following on from Niall's last question, which is a great one, I'm curious, Sharon, about I feel like all of these images, in one way or another, even though some of them do have stages as these sort of central focal points, they all sort of feel like proscenium arches in some way. Like they all sort of feel like they're presenting all of these details in this elongated gaze and really revealing to the viewer these focal points that maybe are innate to the architect, but aren't innate when you're in a crowded place with a lot of people and you're moving through its various spaces. And so I wonder what looking at these images revealed to you about, I'm sure something that you think about a lot in your work, about focal points and about highlighting specific moments in an architectural space. Yeah, I'm curious how you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, what have found so rewarding to spend, you know, this sustained time with her work is, you know, this question, this point you raise about the detail that, first of all, with the sort of absence of people, you're not thinking about exactly how the space is functioning, but you're able to look at its materiality and other atmospheric qualities with more focus. And I guess, you know, one thing that I take away from, you know, this experience is that, especially in the European works, their monumentality that you would expect from these ceremonial places, you know, with the absence of the inhabitant, the ceremony, which is what these spaces are somehow for, you see the images as made up of very small elements, the kind of grain of the marble or the sparkle of a gold leaf piece. And I think that is a very, you know, I think it's just like, again, another kind of dimension to how to look and experience space. And I think it's, I think that's something that I took away from it, that it, in a way, the monumentality frames the view, but because of the kind of play of flatness and depth, it becomes a much more complex and rich viewing experience. And I think that's, I mean, maybe, you know, linking back to Niall's question, why is it relevant? What can architects learn? You know, I think that's profound. That it can be both ceremonial and monumental and intimate and ephemeral. And I think that's really a beautiful way to describe space.
Thanks, Sharon, for that answer. I've got a question from an anonymous audience member who would like me to ask on their behalf. They're wondering, you've spoken about the humanity of how Candida conveys the spaces she photographs. I find them relentless in their depictions of power. Can you speak to that? These are often glorified spaces for a few, for the upper class. Is there perhaps some criticism in her work of these spaces, do you think, versus just a celebration?
I think for sure. I mean, I feel, you know, experientially, I mean, I don't want to be speaking as an art historian, which I'm not, but for me, seeing these spaces empty, which you would often imagine full of ceremonial events, is, I think, you know, I don't know if it's a critique, but it upends an expectation of how space is used. And then, you know, I think the way that many of the images are finally exposed and presented, the quality of light makes them feel, it almost starts to erase qualities of what might be the kind of symbols of power in the room. And I find that for me, that's how I read her presentation of those spaces, that I think she might rely on our expectation of what these rooms are used for, but the way she as an artist conveys them with surface texture, illumination, or flatness, like all of those things make us see an entirely different environment. And I think that's how I guess that one could say that's a critique, but I think it's just deepening and making a more complex reading of these environments is how I see it.
Do you have anything you want to add to that, Niall, before I move on?
I mean, I hadn't thought about that, to be perfectly honest. And I kind of sit here and think, okay, there is such a challenge in capturing what are this historical kind of high, top tier, like top class spaces of collecting of an enormous wealth accumulation through the accumulation of knowledge, libraries being forced into the transition of being something of immense private capital to attempts to go for 400 or 500 years, libraries becoming today like very important public centers. I'm using libraries as an example, but it is interesting. I think the objectivity of it is a bit of the critique, though, like to say like these are the mechanisms of knowledge. Like this is not like in the beginning I was like these are monuments or portraits of like the great things we built, but on the other edge of that sword, I think it's a good point to say these are actually the not just temples but vaults and places of control. But I think the objectivity in her work, I know that word is, I still feel challenged by that word, but the kind of totalizing nature of her work, trying to not like direct your perspective in such a strong way, but try to just show as is, feels like a place where you can have that opinion just as well and really have a really strongly capture the understanding of these places as those of historic inequality and the desperate need for us to make them accessible, which is Sharon is pointing out very graciously that these do feel like I could now go to the Beinecke and go get a book, like in a library that is like protected by 15 different layers of security, but to open your imagination up to borrowing knowledge, which these places are ostensibly for in most cases now.
Yeah, and it's interesting just to expand on that question because I was wondering about this myself. Like there feels to be this very intentional layering of the history of photography with the history of architecture and sort of a layering, like you talked about that totalizing power, Niall. And it's like photography also has a relationship to iconography and to focal points and to all of these issues that are sort of interwoven into these buildings, colonialism and power. And so it is really interesting. It's a great question. Thank you so much, anonymous audience member, for that great question. Marklee is going to ask the next question, so I'm going to pass it over to them.
Sorry, the question was from Rita Actual. It is, will the books and photos studied here have a reference guide?
We might need more clarity on that question.
Yeah, I didn't totally understand the question.
Rita, if you want to repost your question to the forum, we'll ask it again with a little bit more clarity. Do you mean reference guide in terms of exhibition reference guide, or do you mean reference guide in terms of this conversation? Let us know. I know Min has a question too. So Min, I'll give you the chance to unmute to ask.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful conversation. I wanted to ask a little bit about like the timelessness of the spaces, just because hearing the both of you discuss the work, which I haven't seen in person, I think there's a lot more that you discover when you're in front of the print than when you see them on screen, as we did today. And I was wondering if there's traces of time that you find in these photos, because um, based on like the slides that we were looking at, it looked almost pristine, like lack of any sort of history or human presence, almost like too well preserved. And I was wondering if timelessness is something, or is a word you would use to describe Candida's work, and whether that is a consideration in both of your practices as an architect, thinking about history moving forward, or is it more, or do you think about history, or do you, or would you like for your work to be more timeless? How do you balance those things? I'm sure it's a bit of both.
Well, thanks for that really interesting question. And I'll just say a few things, and I'm sure Nile has lots to say on that too. I mean, one thing that I found, I mean, I talked a little about the quality of light in the images, and in many of the, not all of them, but in the European projects, there are windows represented in the work, but there, and I don't think Candida ever uses like artificial light. I don't know that for sure, but it's not like she's making a stage set and putting Klieg lights outside. So on the one hand, there's a sense of time in the image that it's daylight, there is light coming in, but the way that light falls in the room seems highly abstracted to me, which I think is through how she exposes the image and prints it. So on the one hand, there's a sense of time, but it's not, we couldn't track how light falls in the room that you might think of like a Vermeer painting and side light and all these things about the sort of romanticism of that. So literally when she's making the image, I think it's not like we see traces of time in the space. So like how long it takes her to make the image or what time of day, that's all seems somehow abstracted. But and then with respect to the history and the thing of the works, I mean, I find it, I think she, because of that quality of the way the image is exposed and the level of, we've been talking about this dynamism of monumentality and detail, that to me, I think it, I mean, I of course think about history and I think about what's happened in those rooms, but it also feels incredibly contemporary to me. And I think there's a sort of confusion in a way, which is, I think, another like a richness that you feel when you look at the work, that you're thinking about history, but you're thinking about some dust on the stone. You sort of have all those things in your mind. And I feel that's maybe it is timelessness, bridging to our own thinking. I mean, I think we always want to be looking at our work in relationship to history, but we, sort of want to be of all time. I mean, there's something about not being placed in history or resisting that's sort of interesting to us as architects. I don't know, how do you feel about that interesting question?
It is a good question. I think the power of her work and even the curation you made is about kind of destabilizing like history a bit, because what is the one in Philadelphia? It's in front of me. Where is, but basically, why am I going crazy? Oh yeah, the Masonic Temple. There is like this condition of style being related to history, and maybe like the transmutability of style, and kind of how, especially in a bigger show with lots of her work or in the books, you really start to like undo your expectations of ornament and time and history and regionality, even like, something might look Italian or might look French or some sort of like national style, but actually it'll be somewhere totally different, or and at the same time, they're all libraries that have a certain equivalence to one another, that communicate with one another through their archival methodology, this shared idea of like collecting knowledge. And I do think that as a body is so profound, right? That it kind of says, oh, we're not like making this thing right now, or, it's not like a survey of 1950s theaters. It's kind of, it's all of much of like historical architecture, just these kind of types of places that are all about imagination and not about like a specific thing. So I like how that in her work really destabilizes your understanding of time, right? Not just in the object, but I did like what you were saying about the kind of details in the dust, and that like is so related to the printing as well, which like because you really see like such a small object being rendered by like a a pixel of ink, or what, it's not a pixel, but these printing methods that are really amazing. And then also the fact that everything is like in focus, right? Which is like something that hasn't come out, but such a principle of the Dusseldorf school, where like something with a deep perspective could be completely in focus, no blurring. I get like a bit nerdy with photography, so I've tried to like hold off a little bit on getting too technical, but I that's such an important fact that everything's in focus, just like how you see in real life, right? You're not
Yeah. I was just going to say, related to these technical issues you raise, Niall, and just the sense of time. I mean, Herbert and Candida were talking about how it's getting harder and harder to print these images at the size that she wants, because they just like, there aren't print houses that do it. And so it just becomes, even more sort of, this sort of sense of time and technology changing relative to this, her way of looking. I thought that was sort of a profound fact to contemplate.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, because there was this technical achievement like through the Dusseldorf school of printing and photography being a kind of within a united kind of idea. So all this technology was developed, and then kind of in the 80s and 90s when digitization came through, there was a bit of a collapse of like the technical prowess and a rethinking in general. And so much was lost in like darkroom technology, not just I don't mean technology as in machines, but in the skills and the print houses and like that level of complexity. Just and to hear that is like so sad. I mean, it's true. You hear that from a lot of practitioners of these analog arts, that there's a kind of loss in the printing methods.
One last thing I'll say when you get the chance, hopefully, Min, you can see the show, but I think we haven't spoken so much exactly about or precisely about scale. The scale at which she prints the image also, I think, is a really important part of how you feel in front of it. And the bigness of the image makes it more surreal. There's more of everything. And I think that's what I felt spending time with these works, helping put the show together. That was something I really learned, that she's so precise about that scale.
So it's not a malleable scale it's like one image is one scale and that's like the only version.
Exactly.
Yeah, it does. And I wonder, did you get any insight into like how that's developed, or is it just?
I didn't, but I think there's a big difference between 160 centimeters and 180. And 180, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's the one that's really hard to print today.
Right. Okay.
So,
yeah.
I wish I could sure.
Thank you for that super generative question, Min. Our last question today is going to be from Fong. Fong, I'll give you the mic.
I had a question, but I think Nye brought it up already. Maybe I can reframe it differently. I like the Joe Bradley right behind you, Sharon.
Thank you. There's Joe here and Joe here.
Yeah, I know, but the drawing's hard to see, but the robot on paper is so easy to identify. Yeah, he's a good friend of ours. But
cool.
Yeah, Beckner, Ben and Hilda Beckner, to whom she was very close and extract a lot of the idea. But in their work, the accumulation of portraiture is what give up a sense of monumentality, the repetition and whatnot. And I'm so interested that she's able to deviate from it into the sense of her own sense of monumentality. I wonder how you see the work as being a portrait of a space, an architectonic portrait of a space. Would that ever enter your reading the work? Because I'd never thought of it until hearing what you guys are talking about now.
Well, yeah, I mean, thanks for, highlighting, I think, that sensitive difference between sort of documenting something and creating a portrait of something. And I think she, I mean, I read that quote, which is a quote of hers, where she describes the works to some extent, she says, as portraits of spaces. And I mean, I don't know, just to think about perhaps when you work with an architectural photographer, you're trying to tell a story of the architecture. Like, there's a different, it's the word documentary doesn't seem like the right word to use in this context, because I think it's related to her work as well. But there's something more personal about what she's revealing in the space of the spaces. I think that, when as an architect and you hire somebody, you're looking, you want a certain level of transparency between your vision and what the photographer captures. And I feel with Candida, she's telling us stories about these spaces that, are altogether different than maybe the original intent or such of the maker. And I think that's, I mean, I know she's been commissioned to make works with architects, but I don't think that's typically how she works. And so somehow, to me, there's something about just kind of narrative qualities that are come from different points of view between documenting architecture and creating a portrait of a space. Nile, what can you add to that?
Yeah, in some odd way, they kind of remind me early photography was first being deployed as documentation for mostly art books by author Kingsley Porter, mostly Romanesque architecture. But anyway, this is terrific. Thank you so much for coming on. It's so refreshing to have you talk about an artist, really. It's just, that's what we want. It's all somehow overlap in that shared space and thinking. And it's first time Nile is also hosting. So it's nice to see him here with an architect. Hello. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to see you.
Thank you so much, Fong, for that question. And I just want to reiterate thanks to you, Sharon, and to Nile for this conversation, which has been such a pleasure to listen to. And I would also like to give a huge shout out to Preston at Johnston Marklee and to Adair at Sean Kelly for all of their support in preparing for today's event and for providing those beautiful images that we were looking at. The Terra Foundation for American Art sponsors this program and makes daily conversations like this one possible. So we'd love to thank them for their support of this live program, as well as the archive where this will be shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our work. You can support our work in the link in the chat. I also encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter to learn about future events, including tomorrow's at 1 p.m. with Peter Doig and Richard Schiff on the occasion of Peter Doig's exhibition, The Street at Gagosian. It's an exhibition Doig has curated of various artists. And now you all can turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today. And thank you again to Sharon and to Nile.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was
Bye.
Thank you,
great.
Sharon. Thank you, Nile.
Nile. That was
Shout
wonderful.
out, see the show in LA. Yes.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, go see the show in Los
Go see the
Angeles.
show.
Yeah, come see
Thank
the
you,
show.
Sharon.
It's warmer there than in New York.
Yeah.
Do more curation, Sharon. Do more curation, please.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Bye,
Nice to meet you.
everyone. Take
Thank
care.
you. Thank you, Nile.